This is a meeting where we do like to have folks on camera as we're trying to build community, but obviously muted if you're not presenting. So welcome. I see again, is that Allison with her class? Is that OCH 206? Is that Allison? Okay, welcome. Glad to have you.
And you can unmute
Where's the
this.
camera? Oh, it's there.
There we go. Okay. Great. Well, we'll get started in a second. I would ask folks to turn their cameras on, please. Really, again, it's very, very important to us to be building community that we have people with cameras on for this public research workshop. I'm Danielle Allen. I'm the chair of the GETTING-Plurality Research Network. So I'm kind of like in multiple roles today because I'm also I chair this workshop. So I'll say a few things in my role as chair. And then I suppose I'll introduce our commentator, Rob, as well as introducing the team that was working on this paper, and then we'll get going with our conversation. But so the point of these public research workshops is to share recent work about AI and democracy, or AI and ethics, a variety of themes. And we're really interested in the conversation. This is a conversational space. So opening presentations are brief, and then commentators are also reasonably brief, so that then most of the time is really given over to back and forth. We have a norm of expecting always to speak to each other to prove ourselves trustworthy to one another. And so Uma, as the sort of site manager, does also reserve the right to remove people if anything should sort of violate that norm of establishing an ethic of mutual trustworthiness. And in general, because there's so many folks who participate, we do have to ask people to restrict yourself to one question or comment. And we know we all have many, many questions and comments, but so one for sort of oral offerings. And then at the end of every session, we ask people to share further questions in the chat. We just take a moment of sort of silence for people to add questions to the chat, so we can surface all the questions that people have brought into the space, and then the presenters can have those for taking away. We use the raise hand function for putting yourself in the queue. So I'm sure you know where it is, but at the bottom of your Zoom screen, if you can't already see reactions, if you click on the three dots, that should bring up the option of reactions, and that will bring up your raise hand feature. And in addition to the raise hand feature, if you do have a point that connects directly to the subject under discussion, and it's a reasonably small point, you can use the chat and put a caret in the chat like that, which I've just done. That's what we call our electronic version of a two-finger comment. So a sort of short, immediately to the point intervention in that stream of conversation. And we will interrupt the queue to take those caret comments. And then I guess the last thing to say is, was there one more thing? Have I forgotten, Uma, any of our starting norms? Does that pretty much covered everything?
I think that covers it.
Okay, fantastic, terrific. So the paper today is a co-authored endeavor, and there are several of the authors on this call in addition to myself. So I'm one, also Sarah Hubbard, Woojin Lim, Allison Stenger, Shlomit Wagman, and Kinney Zalesny. And so when we get to the Q&A, I will invite all my colleagues to feel free to contribute to responses, and I might ask one or another person to comment. I'm going to do sort of the opening comments, just sort of taking responsibility for the group. But anyway, but people should feel free also to address questions to other authors. And lastly, then I want to introduce our fantastic commentator, Rob Reich, who is a professor of political theory and ethics at Stanford. He has been leading a significant body of work on AI and ethics at Stanford for many years at this point. And Rob, it would also be great if you could remind me of the title of your most recent book, because I don't have that top of mind.
Sure. I collaborated with a computer scientist who's currently the chair of the computer science department at Stanford named Mehran Sahami, and a public policy social scientist, Jeremy Weinstein. The book is called System Error: Where Big Tech Went Wrong and How We Can Reboot.
Great. Thanks, Rob. So thanks very much for being here, Rob. So I'll just kick it off with 5 minutes or so of review of the paper, and then pass it to Rob. So the paper, as you all know, is called A Roadmap for Governing AI, Technology Governance and Power-Sharing Liberalism. And this was the effort of our team to start building out a sort of fairly comprehensive framework for thinking about how to govern AI. There are a couple of basic things that we take care of doing in the paper. So, for example, you'll have seen that we sort of break the task into going through some frameworks for thinking about different categories of risk. We are particularly interested to extend beyond some of the familiar categories to really review implications for social relations, society and the like, for political relations, and then also for economic relations. So that is a kind of key initial sort of definitional piece of work. Also just generally defining concepts in the field. Then we take the time to do some comparative work, identifying normative frameworks that are already in existence in the field in other countries, supporting policy choices. So Japan, China, the UK, EU. And I think that's a very useful exercise because when you take the time to do that, it becomes very clear that policy strategies in any given place do really rest on distinctive normative foundations. And I think it helps bring the question of like what the normative questions are into view. Then we take the time ourselves to propose a normative framework. We draw on a variety of contemporary political philosophy, although my own Justice by Means of Democracy is definitely a kind of central text. And we basically make the argument that the point of technology should be to advance human flourishing. Human flourishing depends, we argue, on empowerment. That puts questions of democracy and political empowerment at the center of good governance. It also then means that social policy and economic policy are equally important, but might be considered through a lens of how well they do at supporting people's empowerment in structures of democratic life. And then after we lay out that normative framework, then we outline a governance framework that relies on the normative framework for addressing the different sort of modalities of harm and opportunity presented by AI. And I think there are a couple of critical things to call to people's attention about that framework. So the first is there's been a sort of ongoing, I think, debate in the field about whether or not near-term harms like bias and discrimination should be the focus of governance, energy, and attention, or whether longer-term, more uncertain sort of existential risks should be the focus of governance, energy, and attention. And we seek in our paper to reject that choice, to reject the notion that there's a binary distinction between those two things. And we lay out an approach in which sort of different branches of any government, our model is the US one, but we think it really applies to any government, sort of are already in the business of addressing each of those two categories of risk. And so what really matters is to make sure that the relevant folks who are already focused on issues of bias and discrimination have the capacity to evolve their work to the AI context. And then relatedly, those agencies and parts of government that are already thinking about long-term risk, existential risk, and the like national security threats that can be sometimes an equivalent language, similarly are able to evolve their capability to address the harder existential risk kinds of questions. So that's one critical intervention. The second critical intervention is that we really focus on opportunities as well as on harms, and think about what kinds of investments we would need in training, in developing people, including with ethics training, who are able to play a role in governance work, thinking about investment in things like public sector compute capacity to be able to stay in sort of meaningful position to hold the private sector to account. So I won't spend more time on it than that. I hope that gives people a sort of rough sense of our strategy for trying to have a framework for thinking about governance in this space. And we're really, really eager to hear, Rob, your comments, as well as the feedback from everybody else in this space. So thanks for being here, everybody.
All right. Well, it's a great pleasure to have been invited to offer a few remarks about Danielle and her colleagues' a paper here. Um, I'll just say what I'm sure is obvious to everybody as a way of placing the paper within the broader landscape of efforts to try to imagine AI regulation, AI governance. The distinctive thing, as Danielle just presented, is that this is, I think, a broad appeal to raise the capacity of the state itself, the democratic state, in order to take a proactive role with an objective function that's worthy of thinking as a democratic theorist or a political philosopher, namely human flourishing as the ultimate aspiration. This marrying of a deep knowledge of regulatory frameworks that currently exist onto a fulsome and broadly minded understanding of the aspirations of democracy and the central importance of human flourishing is what marks this effort off from so many other things we see within the AI regulatory policy governance discussion. I want to spend just a few minutes offering up a sympathetic, but I think gently different or perhaps critical reframing of the basic aspiration with which I am in complete agreement. And I'll give a little bit of texture to this gentle reframing, offer that up as a question for Danielle or her colleagues to respond to, and then add at the very end of my comments two pointed and short questions that I wonder about an answer to, given what the framework provides. Okay. So we've got these two core ideas that regulation should not be reactive, but proactive and adaptive. And we should place regulation of technology in this broader framework of a clear goal, objective function to advance human flourishing within a theory of power sharing, liberalism, and pluralism at the heart. I think it's important to see this proposal as sitting in contrast to what Danielle and her colleagues do catalog to some extent in the paper. And I'll just offer a kind of cartoon version of the standard story of regulation that we're familiar with. That standard story goes something like this. Universities undertake basic research. Private capital, then within a kind of conventional contemporary marketplace, funds innovation in the marketplace. Innovation then gets brought to scale through various forms of market developments, often attended by consolidation of the companies that bring innovation to scale. And then once this innovation gets to scale, the negative externalities become apparent. And now it's time for government to step in and begin to do something about the externalities. And this fits easily onto our basic understanding of the past 30 years of the internet and social media revolutions, in which private capital, driven initially by public sector investments in basic research, funds all kinds of innovation in the marketplace. We get social media that then goes to scale. We find various ways in which there are privacy abuses, various forms of misinformation and disinformation, automation that displaces workers, a whole variety of concerns about algorithmic bias and discrimination, various things now that happen at scale, alongside, of course, extraordinary kinds of benefits. And the basic call then is for government to step in and try to respond at a bare minimum to the negative externalities. So Danielle and her colleagues want to completely change the orientation of the regulatory or governance apparatus to be, as I said, and as she so wonderfully explains, proactive and adaptive in order to establish human flourishing as the real goal. Okay, I am fully on board with this, but here's my gentle reframing, gentle criticism. I want to think that the best way to understand AI governance is as the twin and interrelated dynamic between law, policy, and regulation that flows from or emanates from government, and professional norms and standards and tooling that flows chiefly from the professional field in question, in this particular case, from AI ML developers for AI governance. And that means there has to be, for this second component of governance, an especially large amount of attention paid to the people with the deep technical expertise who are able to formulate not corporate standards one by one for different companies, but genuine industry-wide or professional norms and standards that are the necessary complement to the more formal kinds of regulation that emanate from states. So let me give you a sense of what this could mean in the current moment with respect to AI governance, things I see only at best gestured at in the paper, and want to place more attention here, not on the effort of the government, but on the effort of the professional community. So I'd begin by observing that when it comes to questions about AI governance, the entire field is in a state of, to put it in a charitable way, standards and norms are nascent. To put it in a slightly less charitable way, the field of AI and ML is professionally immature or developmentally immature. Computer science has only come into existence as a field of study in the 1950s and 60s. People who then acquire the skills of a computer scientist or an AI ML developer only acquire any power in the world in the past 20 or 30 years. There has been precious little time to develop what would count as genuinely deep-seated professional norms and standards in a field so young. That means, for example, by attending to the effort to accelerate professional norms and standards can also be a very important mechanism for steering technology for the social goal of human flourishing. Let's take a couple concrete examples. Danielle mentions one of them in the paper, the idea of building human-centric AI. That's now a kind of well-trodden phrase. One has to fill in something about it, but it gives a sense in which a basic kind of professional orientation to human-centeredness is meant to coordinate the activities of people as early as the basic research enterprise, what it is that AI, ML people do within universities and then also within industry. To my mind, we can be even more specific about this. If I wanted to be slightly maybe grandiose or exaggerate only a little bit, my own view is that within the field of computer science, there's been a single orienting foundational question that has coordinated the vast majority of research for the past 50 years, and that is the Turing test. Can a computer scientist find a way to develop a machine that can successfully mimic and perhaps deceive a human being in its behavior or output? And now, 50 years after the Turing test, kind of announced and formalized in various ways, Nils Nilsson took it to its logical conclusion and tried to find metrics for measuring the progress of AI insofar as machines could displace people from the labor force, a clear kind of way of measuring the progress of AI in human replacement or substitution, flowing quite directly from the Turing test. But the Turing test need not be the orienting question. This is a professional norm that binds together computer scientists in their basic work. We can imagine a test that didn't ask about deceiving or mimicking human beings, but rather, in the spirit of Danielle's proposals, what about an orienting foundational question that asked of computer scientists, can we get a machine to augment or cultivate human capacities and capabilities? Can we find ways to develop machines that help coordinate the otherwise uncoordinated activities of human beings? Can we find machines that, in fact, support human flourishing rather than displace or mimic human behavior? Now, that's not something that's going to come from government. That's going to emerge from within the professional community itself, if it ever does. And I'll offer up just one or two other possibilities here, because I think it's important to see that we needn't focus just only on the Turing test as an example, but rather there are ways to think about other opportunities as well. So for those of you with computer science backgrounds, you may remember an interesting debate that happened within the professional community of computer scientists back in the 1970s and 1980s. Doug Engelbart, the local Bay Area person who had the mother of all demos, I think, while he was at SRI here out at Stanford. He was devoted to trying to find a way to develop machines that would serve to augment human capabilities. And his rival in this debate was John McCarthy, another Turing Award winner here at Stanford, who was devoted to trying to find machines that would automate various human behaviors and processes. And this augmentation versus automation debate that played out in the 70s is an important kind of way of observing within a professional community the kind of lodestar question that can then coordinate the work of people in basic research and then into industry. If you don't like the Engelbart-McCarthy way of characterizing this, I'll offer up just one more recent one from the standpoint of venture capital. What are venture capitalists funding in terms of the most interesting innovations within the AI startup universe? A colleague of mine out here, Roy Bahat, who is the lead at Bloomberg Beta, an early seed investment firm in San Francisco for AI companies. He has a lovely way of characterizing this. He says, when we look back in history, we can see that people have tried to fund different kinds of innovations. Think, for example, of the loom, which is a replacement or substitution invention. Looms make unnecessary human labor in various ways. People have also funded what he calls slide rules. Slide rules still require human beings, but they make the human being much more productive or efficient at whatever the task may be at hand. And third, human beings are sometimes fund, or venture capitalists sometimes fund, cranes. Construction cranes is what he has in mind. Things that actually extend the capability of human beings to do things, to build structures that they couldn't do without the invention itself. And his basic view is that venture capital in the current moment funds far too many looms and far too few cranes. Can we find ourselves into a new equilibrium in the investment space, he asks, in which there is more interest in funding cranes, extensions of human capabilities, rather than looms, replacements for human beings? Again, this is not something that could or should emerge from government itself, but rather something that comes from the professional community. So all of this is the way then opposing to Danielle and her colleagues. I would love to hear more about the important place of professional norms and standards or technical tooling whose origin is really outside of government and from the respective professional community of AI and ML development, in order to see how that fits in with the basic aspirations here of AI governance. Okay, I said I would end with two short questions about the entire thing, so I'm going to put these on the table very quickly. There's a short passage in the paper in which Danielle and her colleagues mention the importance of grappling with various forms of catastrophic risk, often grouped under the heading these days of CBRN risks: cyber risks, bio risks, radiological risks, and nuclear risks. These all have implications for national security and indeed for the military aspirations of states. And so I foresee, as I think is not unreasonable for many other people to think as well, that at the moment we have companies at the frontier developing AI and ML frontier models, but given the national security implications of CBRN style risks and capabilities, I think very soon we will have countries that develop their own models, not mere companies. So the kinds of governance questions that arise in this dynamic are not going to be governance that tries to steer technology that emerges from the private marketplace and companies, but rather a geopolitical dynamic in which the frontier technologies are developed and owned by countries themselves. So how could this AI governance roadmap be adapted to think about the geopolitical dynamic of the AI models themselves owned by countries, not just companies? Third and final question. We're in a moment now of a kind of policy window opening in AI, and I would characterize it by saying we're having slow, incremental, possibly even rational progress being made. We have a slow accumulation of different efforts in different countries, and this is a kind of standard aspiration for anyone who thinks seriously about governance. But if you look back historically, of course, it is very often the case that there's a policy shock, an exogenous shock to the system, which forces policymakers to do something rather than nothing, to do it visibly in short order in order to respond to a catastrophe. We have not yet had an AI catastrophe on a sufficiently broad scale to require policymakers to act quickly, a kind of Patriot Act in the wake of 9/11. If and when we have such an AI catastrophe, how does this AI governance roadmap guide policymakers who need to be seen to be doing something in the short run in order to respond to this shock, rather than the slow, rational implementation of the current policy orientation. Thanks, Danielle.
Terrific comments, Rob. Thank you so much. I'm going to offer a few responses and then invite my fellow authors on the paper also to offer just a couple of thoughts. I know there are a lot of us, so hopefully we'll be able collectively to keep it short. That was super thoughtful and really helpful. I will admit, when you said that you were going to be largely on board, but you were going to offer some gentle tweaks and critiques, I was like bracing myself, and I was like, that sounds like the understatement where there's going to be a sort of a massive kind of redirection. But in fact, I think, what you have offered is indeed super complementary. So I think we would for sure endorse the importance of the professional norms point that you were making, both from the point of view of the technological experts, and from the point of view of the investment professional sector. And I hope in this hour we have together, we could throw it back to you, the question of what you see as the best pathways forward for accelerating that. I wonder if there are roadmaps in those spaces, kind of like the one that we have tried to lay out for government, and would there be any value in trying to develop a roadmap of some kind around that acceleration of professional norms? I think of what happened with journalism in the early 20th century. Of course, we've seen the breakdown of that, but there was sort of a lot of concern about, as it was called, yellow journalism at the end of the 19th century. And that did produce a lot of concerted effort to generate professional norms, which gave us a kind of like golden age of high quality journalism through much of the 20th century. So I do think we need projects like that again and would welcome them. I think the deep question underneath that gentle tweak is really whether, is it a mistake to focus so much energy, on government, sort of prior to a point where the professional norms have actually really come to exist? Because at the end of the day, don't you really need the professional norms to anchor, the capacity of government to do anything sound anyway? I think that's a really deep and interesting question. I don't have an immediate answer to it. I think I would want to think that the government's own development of its own professional norms in this space could be part of that story of how you accelerate the norms in the other sectors. So in that regard, I think I would want to say I think there's still value in putting that much focus on the government, even when one recognizes the importance of professional norms. And so I will leave it to Alison Stenger maybe to respond to your question about geopolitical matters, because that's really her specialty. And then the policy window opening, I don't know, Kinney, if you might be interested in weighing in on that one, but that would be a way we could start to bring other authors in. So maybe Alison on the geopolitical question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Thanks, Alison.
My problem is I'm going to turn the video off so my class can leave because the class time is over, but I'm happy to weigh in.
Okay.
So, yeah, I thought that was a tour. Can you hear me okay? I'll try to get right. You can see me.
We can still hear you. We can still hear you.
Yeah, the problem is they're leaving. Do you want to come back to me, maybe take this last question, and then my class will have left so we don't have a single background noise?
Yeah, that's fine. So Kinney, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, hi. It was a super impressive critique, Rob, and so I'm thinking hard about everything you said. I just want to say quickly to support Danielle's response to your point, that to say government can't do this and we need to just wait for industry is a troubling view, I would say. I worked in that industry, and I don't have confidence that they will move quickly or successfully in that regard. So I second Danielle's point that we would need some kind of roadmap or acceleration plan on that front. Okay, on the policy window, it's a really, really good point that even as we've put out this sort of idealistic and very thoughtful and very earnest way that the government should think about its role, you're right that they don't really frequently act that way. They respond to catastrophe, they respond to panic. And so we would advance our own interests if we could produce something that would, like a tool for them to act when that happens. Because you're right that's more likely how they will act and the environment in which they'll act. And so our thoughtful and discursive approach to it, I think, Danielle, ought to be translated into like a not a roadmap, but like a, what do you call something that's like shorter than that, like it more abbreviated than that, like, you know, like a thing you can use on demand or at a glance of like what to do. So I love that idea. It's something I'd like to think about and maybe try to work on.
Great, thanks, Kenny. Allison?
Yeah, I'll jump in now, and then my class is out, and I'll run over to my office to come back in. But just quickly, thanks so much for really demonstrating to my students how to have a serious intellectual exchange. I thought that was wonderful. I was so glad I thought to tune them in. Rob, your critique is fantastic. I just want to, I'll speak on the geopolitical part in a moment, but I wanted to kind of piggyback on Danielle's and Kenny's comment about professional standards. I find that very promising, but I think one thing has changed since the debates between Engelbart and McCarthy, and that's this, that much of the basic research is now in industry rather than in universities. And that presents an enormous problem for developing professional norms. So I think we really do need government in there. That's not to say that we can't keep pushing our colleagues in industry to do the right thing, but they've got competing motives. And that's just a basic reality of how that stands. With respect to the geopolitical element, I support what you're saying there. I think that's a really important question. The development of national AIs that are publicly, that are held by government is something we really need to think about, and indeed may be coming into reality in the not too distant future, precisely because of the potentials for an AI catastrophe that would mobilize governments immediately. But I really liked that point. I think that's something we should be thinking about actively and have in our back pocket for the event of that happening. So I appreciate your comments, and I see them as friendly amendments to what we were trying to do with the paper.
Right.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. So the floor is now open, and so I'll ask people to again use the raise hands function. I do see there's a hand up in our room in the Ash Center, so happy to go there first, but folks, do feel free to add your hand to the queue. Great, thanks, Rob, as well.
I'm happy to address it. Go ahead. Okay, hi, it's Alex. You probably can't see me because I'm hiding at the back of the door, by the door. Rob, thank you for those phenomenal comments, and obviously thanks to Danielle and Kenny and Allison and the whole team for a phenomenal paper. So I sort of three questions or reactions in response to Rob's questions. The first is with respect to sort of norms development for the professional engineers building the technology. And my question is around, again, sort of like what will catalyze and sort of shape those norms, and or do they sort of develop organically? And what role does higher education play? What role does industry norms and sort of mores around responsibility? What role does government policy play? And what role does sort of VC and the investment community play in shaping those norms? And how can we do so proactively and ideally in collaboration to shape a set of norms for the professionals building the technology that we all want to see generate the outputs that are beneficial for human flourishing? So that's one set of questions. In response to Rob's two good questions about sort of government AI and how that would change and sort of shocks to the system, as a former policymaker myself and coming from the national security world, my reaction on sort of government AI is I do think it's likely, but I'm not sure there will be like government by government AI. I think it will be more governments using different kinds of use cases of systems. So it's not going to be like each got like a US AI and an Emirati AI and a Russian AI. It'll be the government's using lots of different systems for different kinds of use cases. And so in one respect that I think it makes it slightly less problematic, but also in some respects much more complicated because it's going to be, I think, a use case by use case set of norms and governance arrangements rather than like a global sort of one size fits all arrangement. But I think what that does is put a premium on starting and rather continuing those kinds of conversations among governments and those sort of norms of responsible use and development that have already begun in the G7, the G20, and the OECD, and really getting down to brass tacks about when governments own and operate AI systems, what should that look like? And there's I think a whole set of political values that differ by country that are going to be difficult to navigate in that respect. But I think to your point, Rob, like the premium is on having those conversations now to shape what comes, because I do think we're starting to see that in some respects. And then with respect to the shocks, I mean,
So Alex, I'm gonna have to actually, you'll have to forgive me, but I'm gonna interrupt you there for a moment. Let Rob respond just for our norm of like, one thing per person, and then we'll
Right.
hope for the second round, okay? And Rob, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one very brief point to dig into what you gestured at, Danielle, and as a response to some of this about the interconnected dynamic between professional norms and standards and law, policy, and regulation, and the sense in which, as you put it, Danielle, that these professional norms and standards and actual technical expertise might be the necessary anchor for state capacity and governance itself. And so what I have in mind here is to think back, into the last century, in which people who got economics degrees certainly flooded into private industry and brought their various economic toolkits and skills to bear, but also have populated nearly every agency within government and brought cost-benefit analysis and a variety of other tools drawn from the economic profession to the very task of developing state capacity policymaking, a kind of science, if you will, of policymaking. Technologists, by contrast, even though they're the most important profession of the 21st century, tend to view government service with disdain and don't go to serve within government and bring their technical skill sets to bear. And that's partly why we're still stuck, as it were, with the cost-benefit analysis toolkit of the 20th century in government with respect to negative externalities that government should step in to address, as opposed to something that is fully cognizant of the digital revolution, where the skills of AI and ML and computer science more generally are what's needed inside government. So I'm just trying to give some flesh there, Danielle, to the anchor that I have in mind about state capacity and governance itself.
Danielle, do you mind if I say one thing more about this connective tissue point?
That's fine. Go ahead, Glenn.
So it strikes me that you're both right, and yet there's like sort of something in between that's missing a little bit, which has to do with the types of interventions that would actually be useful to permit an environment that allows for those norms to develop, which I think are a qualitatively different type of government role than is anything described in the paper. And they have to do with norms and the ideas that Danielle developed in her work on a connected society, because I think a fundamental problem we have is there's a profound cultural and social disconnect between the technologist community and the rest of society that they are meant to be serving. And I think this is the reason that, and I don't think that existed, by the way, fully in 1960s. And I think that's why Engelbart was so successful, and the role of the Defense Department and the way it set a certain set of norms and whatever. And that developed during the 1970s and 1980s. And I think that has to be addressed using a very different set of interventions that has to do with changes to the educational system, changes to the set of museums and cultural institutions that exist, changes to the social networks and where things are developed and the relationships that people have and the kinds of people that are in the tech industry. Like all that stuff has to change, I think, in order for professionalization to work in a way that is going to be supportive of the type of goals that you're talking about. And I think Japan and Taiwan, which have a completely different social graph structure and cultural affordances and educational system along those lines, are like getting a different sort of culture here because of the differences in those other factors, which the government can influence but aren't discussed in this report.
Thanks for those thoughts, Glenn. Appreciate that. I think we're ready to go to the next hand in the queue, Richard. And I should have said too, if folks could also share, where are you zooming in from before you share your question? That would be really helpful.
Hi, thank you. I'm in New York City. And yeah, I think I want to sort of suggest another angle from this work, which is great in the sort of the perspective that it took, but I think there's a complementary angle that could be very important that sort of changes the landscape, which is the idea of personal AI agents. And it's just sort of emerging. But the whole idea is that this is a way to increase individual autonomy and basically level the playing field between individuals and groups of individuals and institutional AIs. Sort of the idea of have your AI agent talk to my AI agent, so that it's not an unaided human that's dealing with this complex black box of AI. And there's an interesting slide deck, Richard Witt at glia.net. I put the link in the chat. Gave a presentation recently on this and went into some of the details of how you can structure interoperability between personal agents and institutional agents. And so that seems like if you enabled that, that would give you a powerful mechanism to ensure the kind of things that you've got in your four propositions of agency and representation. So even though it's sort of off in a different direction from what you've covered, I think it might be worth treating. And I'm curious on, whether you agree that that is a promising way to achieve the objectives that you've outlined.
Thanks a lot for that question, Richard. I appreciate it. And so, I mean, your question, the sort of intuitions behind your question are spot on in the sense that the framework that we have developed is one that we also think could and should be used to support choices about development itself. And so I think this actually also speaks to Rob's point about the professional norms among engineers, right? So in other words, if these professional norms took hold, shaped this way, then development projects, with a shape like the one that you just articulated would become the norm rather than the exception. With regard to the specifics of whether or not AI agents are a good example of that sort of augmenting capacity that would, align with the picture of flourishing and empowerment we've sketched, I think that seems possible. I'll have to admit I haven't actually thought about that specific use case enough, but it's a really interesting idea and conversation and would love to pursue. I imagine that others in my group as well may have thoughts about that already. So I don't know if anybody wants to speak up from the authorship group on that subject of personal agents. Anybody want to pipe up on that? Okay. So maybe not right now, but I do think, the structure of thought that you just sketched is exactly what we would be interested in. And thank you for putting that specific question on the table. And I think we'll look forward to engaging it more fully.
Great. Yeah, I'd be happy to get involved.
Yeah, great. No, absolutely. Would love to follow up and talk more about that. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Sure.
Terrell, I think you're next.
Yeah, I'm calling in from Burlington, Vermont. Several things. One is the professional norms isn't going to evolve fast enough. And quite frankly, with managers looking at the profit incentives, venture capital, et cetera, that they're going to go where the money comes first, not where, flourishing will happen over the generations. And governments also, I mean, they're, whether it's so democratic or not, the politicians, and quite frankly, some of the greatest fears are about governmental control of AI and the regulations being massaged to fit their elite interests. And AI isn't going to confine itself to national borders. Don't we need an international, global response to regulation, whether it's from a UN agency, a nonprofit launched by various AI entrepreneurs who are really nervous about what they themselves are creating? I don't want governments or corporations in the position, and I don't trust quite frankly, the professionals either, because they're not going to do it quickly enough. Don't we need some global response?
So I think I do have some thoughts on this, which I will share in a sec, but I'd love to invite Allison to join in first. And Allison, I think as a part of responding, you said earlier that things are different now because so much of the basic research happens inside of companies.
Yeah,
it took you to be meaning that the kind of, call it separation of powers, if you will, between the academy and corporations was part of what helped professional norms develop in previous points in time. and that kind of separation of powers is now absent, and therefore we have a more significant danger, sort of monopolistic danger to confront. I think if that's correct, it would be great for you to spell that out a bit more, and then also respond to Terrell's questions, which I think are connected to both those points.
Yeah, they're really, really good. And I'm just trying to digest the point that must have happened while I was walking over. So let me gather my thoughts. Yeah, it's a different environment. And I guess I would say it's absolutely imperative that we take a global approach. In fact, I've just co-authored another paper for the annual review of political science that argues for a dual track approach, which is basically working with the world to establish certain norms and rules that democracies and authoritarian regimes can agree upon, but also at the same time doing as much as we can with our NATO allies to build up governance of the free world, for lack of a better term. And the whole point is basically an obvious one, but it needs to be made, that in the midst of all the anti-China rhetoric, there really are some things we can agree with China on, that we can lock in as confidence-building measures, if you will, at the same time that we're working to establish how best to defend human flourishing and or move toward it and defend democratic sustainability. So that paper is about to come out. I'm copying it right now, so I would share it if I had it. What was the other point?
Well, just
separation of powers, right?
Yeah, between the academy and corporations.
This is a key piece, and it's why I'm writing a book called Who Elected Big Tech. I think we don't just have a separation of powers. I think there's a kind of an imbalance of power between technology companies and the US government right now that is due to a lot of factors, but makes it very hard for plans for governance that leads to human flourishing to become reality. And that's just the world we deal with and we're living in. And we have to do all we can to change those set of circumstances. But the first step, in my view, I'm not necessarily speaking for the group, but I think they might agree with me, is to acknowledge the power realities on the ground, because you've got to work with those if you're going to be aiming at effective change. Otherwise, you'll miss the mark.
I appreciate that. I think, Terrell, the thing I would add is, there's no question that a global framework is necessary, but I would say the question is like, what do we mean by global? And I would really sort of second what Allison said there, that is, I think one needs private sector actors, public sector actors, and so private sector, both for-profit and nonprofit, and public sector actors sort of all in the business of doing the right things here. And one of the challenges is, of course, that you can't get folks always to do the right things just by exhorting them to do so. So it's partly about how we build, a universe of incentive systems and the like. And so I do think there absolutely will be a role for kind of global conventions, as Allison was pointing to, but those global conventions will partly have to be developed by national actors. I don't think that there is a sort of a global actor as such that on its own can be a counterweight to the kinds of powers that exist either in private for-profit sector, or public sector. So I think we need the sort of the different entities or areas of agency sort of all acting, and we need to do sort of work to try to get them all acting in productive directions and not harmful directions. But I think it's a super important set of questions for sure. Jonas, I think you're up next. And please do share where you're zooming in from.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Danielle. I'm calling from South Africa, and I was invited by Glenn. I currently run a nonprofit research lab that focuses on AI governance in Africa. And most of the research is around AI policy and also technical alignment. My question, first of all, thank you very much for this amazing paper. And I really enjoy the terminology and also the suggestion of the framework. My question was around how should we think about this idea of power sharing liberalism versus compute imbalances that might be present in some of the countries. How should we think about resource-constrained countries that are looking to have that governance strategy? And also this year, we are also seeing a lot of democracies voting for the first time, and this framework is very applicable to that. And I think it's very useful to think about human rights, human agency alongside democratic stability.
Super helpful. Fantastic. I appreciate that. And I guess I would love to just partly throw the part of your remarks that, aligns with the question you put in the chat back to you as well. So this question of, how should we think about resource-constrained countries looking to have a governance strategy? What are some thoughts you have about that question? Oops, I think you're muted. You're muted.
Sorry. Thank you. But I really was looking forward to hearing some of your insights. But I do think that this idea of plurality and plural governance is very well fitting, unlike the other rhetoric that you mentioned very early on around discussing AI through the existential lens. I feel like the plural lens is more helpful in understanding, especially in these emerging economies. And I think just really having a coalition is something that is helpful. Just having, and I think that is also something that you are pleading in the paper. So having both civil communities being able to have their democratic deliberation embedded into the models, and also being able to have their opinions democratically being inputted into the models, I think that would be a great step.
Thanks, Furla. I really appreciate that suggestion. And I would love to figure out how we could support work from this community or elsewhere to answer the question that you've asked. Because I don't think we do have good answers to your question. We thought about it, Jonas. So we definitely thought about the question of, what does it mean? So we knew we were developing a roadmap with the US government as a model, and therefore we're developing a roadmap in a context where the country as a country has a certain level of resources, but also there's a very robust tech economy, right? And so a lot of the actual companies, corporations doing the work are sort of based in the US, and we recognize that set of circumstances doesn't pertain everywhere. But beyond that recognition, we didn't have the bandwidth to step outside of that context and really try to revisit all these questions from an alternative perspective that would be required. So at any rate, I think that's really important further work, and would love to find a way for us to connect with you and think about how can we extend the question in the direction that you're pointing to. So thanks a lot for putting that on the table. Lucas.
Hello, I'm in Smith. We've had well over $30 billion in funding go to one industry in one city in 1 year. And as a startup founder and community or organizer in AI, my question is, what do you guys want the industry to do? And more personally, what requests do you have for any startups or projects to be built?
Great, perfect, Lucas. Before I ask folks to answer, and I'll ask Rob to weigh in on that one as well. I'd love to ask Allison Humphrey to share a thought, because I know she has to leave at 1. So Allison, maybe you could share your thought, and then we'll come back to Lucas's question about industry.
Thank you so much. Let's see. So I'm coming from Toronto, from the Global Strategy Lab at York University, and I just shared in the chat, there's a paper that our lab put together with 224 studies. It was an analysis of 224 international treaties about global challenges ranging from environmental to human rights, humanitarian, maritime, security, trade, and finance. And the top takeaway was that of the 4 treaty design mechanisms considered, the only one with the potential to improve effectiveness was the inclusion of enforcement mechanisms, such as prescribing financial sanctions on countries or expelling countries from treaty bodies. And in contrast, the study found that complaint, oversight, and transparency mechanisms were not associated with greater treaty effectiveness.
Thank you for sharing that. So it's a super important resource for folks to draw on. So Lucas's question. All right, Rob, do you want to go ahead and vocalize your answer?
Yeah, I'll offer a quick thought. It's a good question. So I just put something in the chat there. So one obvious answer, Lucas, I think, is that we need a third-party market, the emergence of a third-party market for things in AI safety testing, auditing. Think perhaps about the little bit that's emerged within the trust and safety roles that often attach to companies, in which we now see some third-party market services there. More generally, though, I'll go back to the kind of talent pipeline question where I think about this from the standpoint of how the VC firms and the investors for startups are oriented. I'm concerned right now that the overwhelming choice of AI ML talent is pushed toward extending the capability frontier of AI ML, as opposed to choosing to work on various forms of safety tooling, various forms of mitigations that are the necessary complement to simply pushing the capability frontier forward. So finding ways in which there's, within the incentive compatible aspects of the marketplace itself, opportunities for establishing a greater scientific understanding of the actual behavior of models, and then understanding that better forms of internal technical tooling and mitigation for some of the obvious potential harms that the models pose. Channeling all of our talent towards the capability frontier is, I think, a big mistake. And we currently have something in the neighborhood of incentive compatibilities in so many companies. In order to continue to champion the ordinary products that they now begun to offer, will need to put in place various mitigations, and they'll need to direct talent toward that as well.
Anybody else from our group want to share a response to Lucas? Yeah, Shlomit.
Yeah, hi. I'm happy to share a contribution to a previous comment about the global coalition and efforts and how to combine private sector and government together with global challenges. And I think that the global community has faced similar challenges in other industries as well, in which you have the need to bring together private sector and government together in order to build an environment which would support and promote certain values, for example, the financial system. And therefore, I mean, there are tools to try and build upon in order to try and create that. It's extremely challenging, but a global coalition, as was mentioned earlier, is definitely the right way to go, combining the private and public sector together. And FATF, for example, money laundering, financial system are great, good examples to build upon. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you, Shlomit. I appreciate it. We're coming close to the end of our session, and shortly I will turn to opening up the chat for everybody to surface what are the kind of top questions that you still have. But before we get that, I want to just check and see if anybody else wants to put their hand up and contribute to the ongoing discussion here. Any other raised hands? I'll make sure I haven't missed anybody. Okay, given that, so yes, as I said, what we like to do is take the last sort of stretch of time to take sort of 5 minutes of silence. It always feels a little awkward, but 5 minutes of silence to let people just think and put in the chat whatever is the major question that you have. And then we'll take a look at them and pick out a couple to respond to before we conclude, okay? And so Rob, you can also be reviewing the questions and think about whether there's one that you want to respond. So 105, we can turn cameras off while we do this as well. We'll turn cameras back on at 105, okay? you please do start putting your comments in the chat or your questions in the chat so we can all collectively take a look at them. Terrific. Thank you for those questions from folks. This is probably the moment for those of you who are still working on any questions that you're posing to go ahead and put them in the chat. So let's see. So I think I might start with the question about the AI regulatory body. I think it's probably maybe worth clarifying the argument we made there in the paper. Oh, let me turn my video back on. Sorry about that. So the idea was less that there would be one body that took care of all AI regulations, and rather that insofar as every governmental agency will find itself responsible for AI regulation, that there needed to be a coordinating function as well. So the idea of the AI regulatory body would be really a coordinative function rather than replacing sort of all existing agencies. So in that regard, I think it's a lighter lift for a creation of such a thing than it may have sounded. And that might be a place where for further iterations, we need to revise for clarity's sake about precisely what it is we have in mind. So thank you for calling attention to that dimension of the paper. There's a lot of really terrific thoughts in here. And so it's a lot to process. Does anybody else from the author team want to weigh in on one of the questions here? How to get the scale of AI governance right is an excellent question as well. Yeah, Allison, did you want to take one?
Yeah, I'm still haven't digested all of them. They're really, really excellent questions and super helpful.
Exactly. Yeah.
The scaling question is, I think, related to some of the points that Rob raised at the beginning about the prospects for national AI models and also the dual track approach I mentioned. Because you scale through a dual track approach, and you could scale through, a CERN for AI that involved the Europeans and the Americans.
Yeah. On the issue of this
Yeah.
of scaling so that you can minimize risks at the macro use levels while allowing decentralized experimentation. I mean, on that, that's the reason why we were trying to work through the risk categorizations and make use of that EU framework, because we wanted to be able to empower people to say, X uses, trigger regulatory attention and Y uses do not. And so that's part of where that kind of risk categorization effort comes in. What we were trying to do with it was to try to achieve that scaling balance. Rob, are you seeing anything in here that you'd like to respond to?
The main thing that I think we would just pick up from a variety of the different questions is the sense in which we're in, if a policy window is opening as a general matter dating back to the EU, we're in an even more nascent stage of internationalizing various forms of governance. And so to put something near term on our, on the agenda here, out of the UK AI Summit came the UK AI Safety Institute with a decision then to have a next meeting in South Korea, and then later this year, early next year in France. Of course, the US AI Safety Institute is just now being stood up as a result of the executive order. I think it would be a disaster if we had a massive proliferation of national AI safety institutes, every country with its own efforts at creating various forms of safety testing. These safety institutes in their nascent formation can and should be in some form or fashion coordinated loosely to have a global orientation. What the mechanism is to bring that result about is, to me, unknown, but that's a near time horizon, I think, imperative for thinking about some of the internationalization or globalization of a governance framework.
Agreed with that, Rob. Are you working on that by any chance?
Yes, I'm trying to nudge my fingers into that. Exactly.
Okay, great. So we have to sign you up to give one of these presentations on that paper when it's done.
Sure.
Excellent. Okay, I like that pre-commitment. Thank you, Rob. We'll follow up on that. All right, I think that is it. We will capture all of the other comments in the chat. Thank you, everybody, so much for your thoughtfulness. I'm sorry that we weren't able to address all the themes that you added, but it's all really helpful and valuable. So good to see everybody. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for a great session.
And more comments here too in the chat. So there's just always more. There's so much richness here. So thank you. We'll look forward to seeing you